This is part 1 of the Grazing 101 Riparian Areas in Grazing Management presentation. Here, we introduce riparian areas in grazing and describe the 4 principles of range management as they apply to riparian areas. Grazing is a natural process. Countless numbers of grazing animals, including bison, were present on the North American continent prior to the arrival of European man. The goal of range management today is to have modern-day management practices mimic the natural processes of the past. Accounts by early explorers and fur traders allude to high populations of bison and poor range condition in some locations. Records of the Hudson's Bay Fur Company describe overgrazing by bison in Western Canada to the point that little forage existed for their horses. These accounts are most likely true. However, when bison left an area, they seldom returned for several years, which gave the range enough time and rest to recover. So it was this net migration of bison on the landscape that ensured that grazing pressure was not constant. After grazing, there was always rest. Bison spent the spring and summers in the open prairie and moved to the parkland and foothills in the fall and winter. This poem by Wallace Stegner gives an account of how severe the grazing pressures from bison were in the past. Historic records of use by people in the Boundary Commission found that there was heavy use at times. However, another early explorer, Fiddler, wrote that the place to find wood was along the Highwood River, in the riparian area, which indicates that heavy use was sporadic or in limited areas. In the 1870s, the first act of federal range regulation occurred that signified the breaking point between natural systems and European presence. What was learned from this act is that we don't want it all to be about regulation and conflict, as it tends to be in the United States. Europeans were among the first to settle in the prairies, and the grazing system subsequently changed from an open, climatically driven cycle to a system where humans and grazing pressures were settled and static on the landscape. Settlers also established their homes and ranch operations next to water since they relied on it. Ranching operations were big, with large open pastures, as shown in this slide, of a typical foothills ranch. Livestock were fenced into an area, and grazing pressures no longer followed the migratory pattern of bison. These early operators often didn't have a good understanding of sustainable range management, and overgrazing by cattle was most often the end result. Riparian areas are important for water quality, water quantity, biodiversity, forage, and habitat. The question is now, how can we manage our range and pasture to maintain healthy riparian areas? These are 4 simple range management principles for grazing in riparian areas. Balance animal demand with available forage supply. Distribute livestock evenly, avoid or minimize grazing during fragile or vulnerable periods, and provide effective rest after grazing. These 4 principles apply to upland grazing as well. Now let's look at these 4 principles in a little more detail. The first is balance animal demand with available forage supply. This is done mainly through stocking rates that utilize an appropriate amount of forage but leave some carryover. It is important to leave enough litter, carryover, or residue to protect the vigor of plants, to protect the soil from erosion, and to conserve moisture and provide emergency forage. This slide shows some good mud in a riparian area trapped in the residue after a spring flood. The carryover is necessary to trap sediments like these, bind soil, and dissipate stream energy. The second principle is to avoid or minimize grazing during vulnerable periods. In riparian areas, there are 2 main times to watch. One is mainly during the spring, when stream banks or shores are saturated, soft, and are vulnerable to trampling and compaction. The other time is when trees and shrubs are susceptible to grazing and browsing, particularly when the grasses have matured off, like hot and dry summers, late in summer, fall and winter, or the grasses haven't started to grow yet, winter or very early spring. The key is to ensure the level of browsing is limited by ensuring that livestock have grass or other feed so they don't focus too much on the woody plants. Initial growth and energy storage is critical. Grazing very early will use up stored energy or carbohydrates before the plant can put up enough new leaves to start building new energy or carbohydrate stores. The third principle is to distribute livestock evenly. Due to the selective grazing habits of livestock, localized overgrazing often occurs even if proper stocking rates are used. Distribution of livestock can be achieved by using various management tools to spread the grazing pressure over the landscape. This is where you, the producer, are the expert. You know whether your animals will respond to salt placement, fencing, water development, herding, or some other tool to take the pressure off the sensitive range. The last principle is to provide effective rest after grazing. It is important to give plants rest when the conditions are right to allow them to rebuild roots and to restore their energy supply and roots. Effective rest is key. Rest allows not only the tops to grow, but the roots as well. This means rest during the growing season. As this slide shows, the 4 plants represent, from left to right, never grazed, once grazed, several times grazed, and every 2 weeks grazed. You can see the response of both the roots and the upper portion of the plants. The adage, keep down the shoot, kill the root, applies to both non-woody and woody plants. Is this seedling resistant to grazing? The answer is no. This seedling is approximately 6 to 8 weeks old. How old or how large does it have to get before it is resistant to grazing? Likely until it reaches a pole stage or is about the diameter of your thumb. Unlike herbaceous plants, woody species may require more than 1 grazing season of rest to ensure that young seedlings like this are resistant to grazing. Continuous grazing and long grazing seasons are the heart of the problem for riparian areas. Riparian areas are magnets for livestock. There is usually plenty of water, forage, and shelter. Riparian areas are essentially the local taverns of the bovine world. We need to manage where and when livestock graze to prevent them from spending too much time in these areas. Why do long, continuous grazing systems fail? The simple answer is that they go against all 4 of the grazing principles explained previously. Long, continuous grazing systems allow cattle to graze where and when they choose to, and therefore do not provide protection for plants and stream banks during vulnerable periods, do not provide adequate rest, and results in poor distribution of livestock and intense grazing. If things are in balance, we can obtain pastures that are an expression of what they successionally want to be, and they can be in good condition, both in the riparian and upland ranges. If these 4 principles are out of balance, the successional spring is being forced downward, and we get pastures that look like this, where the vegetation is overgrazed and held back from its optimum state. When things are in balance, the succession spring is released, and the plant community becomes an expression of what it wants to be. There are some key considerations to try and build into your management practices when grazing in riparian areas. Maintain the right vegetation species. Plants that are deep-rooted, like willows, or plants that grow in mats, like sedges, are great. It is also good to have some species diversity or layering of vegetation types. Maintain adequate cover to dissipate stream or wave energy, trap sediment, and prevent erosion. And avoid grazing during vulnerable periods. One can say these are the tools and techniques to try and outsmart a cow, what riparian management is really all about. Some tools you can look at incorporating into your operation are alter livestock distribution using salts, fencing, water development, or herding. Change how animals access water by providing an off-stream watering site or a localized access point. Control timing of grazing by avoiding grazing riparian areas in the spring when they are vulnerable. Add more rest to the grazing cycle to enhance plant vigor. Allow seedling, tree, and shrub species time to reach a more grazing-resistant stage and allow for bank building. Here are some more tools and techniques to outsmart a cow. Control grazing intensity by adjusting stocking rates to improve plant vigor and species composition and leave carryover. Create riparian pastures by fencing a riparian area into a separate pasture to be able to better control time, length, and rest periods of the grazing cycle. Implement a grazing system whereby range management principles and practices are put to use to enhance livestock production and improve overall pasture condition. Examples include things like deferred rotation and rest rotation. We'll look at these 2 grazing systems in more detail a little later. Build corridor or exclusion fencing. If you notice, we've chosen to talk about this option last. We want you to know that there are more options available than restricting livestock's access completely from riparian areas. However, in some cases this option has worked well and is sometimes the only option in high-risk or chronic problem areas. Management options are like a giant toolbox. Searching for the right tool might take a little time and some tinkering, but in the end, with so many choices, you are likely to find the one that works. It is the choices you make on how to manage the land that really determine how your land will look, as this fence line contrast illustrates. Thank you for listening, and thanks to all the Cows and Fish funders and supporters for their commitment to stewardship and riparian health in Alberta. More information on Cows and Fish programs can be found on our website, www.cowsandfish.org. You'll find much about riparian ecology and grazing management, including the Caring for the Green Zone, Riparian Areas and Grazing Management booklet. You'll also find information on community-based stewardship, our contact information, and donation opportunities. The other segments of the full presentation are also available on our website.